Okay, let's speak to Ihsaan Gardee, who is in Quebec City. Ihsaan is Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. So, Ihsaan, we began the discussion by me asking Chris if I would feel safe being born in Pakistan, British citizen, Pakistani. Would I feel safe coming to Quebec City? You are there. Chris said I would be safe, but I may not feel as safe as he would want me to feel. How do you feel in that city?
Thank you for having me on, Adnan. I think, you know, the feeling here in Quebec is that obviously after the shootings in Quebec City, there was a tremendous outpouring of support, and that was incredibly heartwarming and welcome. We heard this from across the country and from here in Quebec, politicians, elected officials, media personalities, and others speaking out against hatred and xenophobia. Unfortunately, that appeared to be quite short-lived. We've seen continuing patterns of hatred here in Quebec, as well as other parts of the country. In Quebec City, just in December alone, the chief of police noted a doubling of hate crimes targeting Canadian Muslims in Quebec City alone, from 21 incidents in 2016 to 42 incidents in 2017. Within 36 hours, for example, of the news breaking that the city of Quebec had sold land to the mosque in question to use as a cemetery, the car of the president of the mosque was firebombed. So there is still growing concern, and there still is this unsettled feeling amongst Muslims here in Quebec City, as well as across the country. You know, there's a debate about semantics, about terminology, about whether or not you know, people are comfortable with the word Islamophobia. I think that, you know, that should not negate or take away from the responsibility of all stakeholders, including governments at all levels, to speak out unequivocally, to take action where they can to recognize this phenomenon and to have a conversation about, you know, how we can work together to address this.
Ihsaan, I've read articles written by Canadian Muslims saying that they feel marginalized, that they feel otherized, which I've also spoken to Chris about. But my question to you is, how much are Muslims themselves to blame for being marginalized, if indeed that is the case? Because there is a certain amount of political apathy amongst Canadian Muslims. You know it as well as I do. I know it from research. You must know it firsthand. For example, voter turnout amongst the Canadian Muslim community is below the national average. They're not as engaged as other members of the Canadian wider nation.
Well, thank you for that question, Adnan. You know, I would dispute the engagement levels in our last 2015 election due to the efforts of organizations such as ours, as well as other organizations such as the Canadian Muslim Vote. We saw, yes, historically, the voting trends amongst the Muslim population tended to be low, but in the last federal election, due to those efforts, we saw voting rates increase to 79% across the country and 88% just within the Greater Toronto area alone. So yes, there is obviously more work that can and does and will continue to need to be done. There are elections that are occurring regularly across the country, including right here in Quebec, which in our view helps to explain partly why there are some political parties that unfortunately are not in favor of this call that NCCM has made for a national day of remembrance and action on Islamophobia. At the same time, our call was actually not addressed to the provincial government. We addressed it to the federal government. And of course, we welcome others supporting. And we've seen now a momentum building, a groundswell of support building for this call. We've had over 70 Canadian Muslim organizations endorse the call, over 24 of our interfaith and civil society allies, including groups like the United Church of Canada, the Canadian Labour Congress, Amnesty International, and municipalities as well coming on board, with the cities of Markham, Hamilton, St. John's, and other cities considering this week making announcements of proclamations of days of remembrance and action on Islamophobia. Of course, this is a symbolic step, and it's a first step, but symbols matter, Adnan, and it's important to us that we recognize this day not only just to honor the memory of the victims, the 6 men who were killed and who left behind 17 orphans and 6 widows, but also the 19 others who were injured, and the reverberations that have been felt by this act. The first time in history in North America where somebody has walked into a mosque and deliberately targeted worshippers. This is an important day, and it's important because we also have precedent. This is not something new that NCCM and our allies are calling for. December the 6th is recognized as a National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women in honor of the 14 women who were killed in 1989 at the École Polytechnique. Does that mean that all Canadians are misogynistic or all men are misogynistic? Of course not. In the same way, it doesn't mean that a call for remembrance and action on Islamophobia implies that all Quebecers or all Canadians are Islamophobic. What it does is it recognizes that this is a phenomenon that is occurring, that governments, while they can't legislate tolerance and acceptance, do have a responsibility. Our elected officials have a responsibility to speak out against this culture of impunity that exists towards hatred and hateful commentary in order to make sure that they are leading the population and doing their jobs.
Okay, Ihsaan, you need to be brief in this last question that I'm going to put to you. Canada has long been considered one of the nicest countries in the world. The people are so well behaved. They know exactly how they're supposed to relate to their neighbors, to the rest of the country. Everybody holds it up as an example of good behavior. Has something changed in the country in the past, 10, 20 years? I've got 2 pages here of examples of Islamophobia. However big, however small, they are examples of Islamophobia. Has something changed?
Well, I think that, that reputation that Canada has around the world, it's not surprising. People do tend to look to Canada as a model for multiculturalism. And yes, I think Canada is certainly doing some things right. But of course, I think more can and does need to be done. And we do need to recognize that, hatred, Islamophobia, and other forms of xenophobia, as anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, these are real problems. And they require real solutions. And they are something that one community alone cannot solve. We need to have all stakeholders, governments, educators, media as well plays a role and a responsibility to ensure that we're having these courageous conversations and looking at ways to address this both in the short, medium, and long term.
Ihsaan Gardee in Quebec City, thank you very much indeed. We will leave the discussion there with you.